Good evening. I'd like to call our Town of Sydney regular council meeting to order at 6 p.m. on Monday, September the 11th. Good evening to my colleagues on council. In the council chamber this evening, to my far left is Councillor Novick, Councillor O'Keefe, Councillor Rantoul, to my far right, Councillor Duncan and Councillor Garnett. I'm Mayor McNeil-Smith, and joining us, participating via Zoom this evening, welcome Councillor Duck. Good evening to staff. I did have a couple of members of the public recently indicate that when they do tune in from time to time on the live webcast, that they don't get a chance to see staff all the time when they're speaking, but and they certainly are aware of many of our staff, but I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge the staff attending this evening. Ms. Nelson, our corporate officer, Mr. Hissick, our Director of Finance and Acting CAO, Ms. Verhagen, our Director of Current Planning, Mr. Newcomb, our Director of Community Planning, Ms. Judson, our Manager of Communications, Ms. Clary, our Director of Engineering, Parks and Works, and Mr. Demare, our Manager of Engineering. And good evening to members of the public here in the council chamber, and to those who may be watching the live stream webcast tonight or watching a recording of our meeting at a later time from our website. I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that we're holding this evening's meeting in the territory of the Saanich people, and want to acknowledge and express our gratitude for the stewardship that the Saanich people have had for these lands for millennia, and that their long-standing relationship with these lands continues to this day. In turning to approval of the agenda, I'll note that in addition to the agenda that was published on our website last Thursday, we have one additional piece of correspondence that will append to the agenda and consider it amended, and that is a letter of correspondence from Ms. Quantes, and that will go under item 6A on our agenda. So I would seek a motion from council to approve the agenda as amended.
So moved.
Second.
We have it moved and seconded. All in favor? That motion carries. Thank you. We'll next turn to our regular public participation period, and it provides an opportunity for members of the public to come forward and address council. We ask that you provide your remarks in approximately under 4 minutes. And I'll call for a first time if there's anyone wishing to come forward to address council this evening. Please come forward. There's just a little button at the bottom of the microphone to make it live with the red light, and if you could provide your name and community of residence, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Mayor and Council. My name is David Kim Millburn. I reside at 10520 Lyme Grove Crescent here in Sydney. So I'm speaking to elaborate a little bit on my letter in agenda item number 15 regarding the need for a sidewalk on Allbay Road, and as well as some of my suggestions for general intersection improvements as part of the active transportation plan. And I wanted to thank, and with my appreciation for the Director of Engineering, Jen Clary, for her prompt response to my letter. And Ms. Clary indicated that the traffic data ranges from 651 vehicles to 1,974 vehicles per day on Allbay between Bowden and Resthaven Drive. So I compared this to CRD 2013 data for northbound traffic at Beacon and 5th in central Sydney, and that varied from 1,250 vehicles to 2,717 vehicles per day. So that peak travel has no doubt increased in central Sydney since 2013, but this was data that was available to me that feeling as though that this was somewhat comparable in context to north to Allbay Road. So through my correspondence, I now understand that the barrier to pedestrian path or sidewalk on Allbay is due to the subdivision bylaw, and that the cross-section does not provide for one. So I asked that the town evaluate Allbay Road in the future in any upcoming revision to the bylaw, and I understand that that is part of the work plan for council and staff. So, while I did not address this in my letter, the street lighting too is limited throughout this section of the road, and parking on both sides of the roadway has increased in recent time, there have been revisions to the roadway, and those have been improved and provided for this additional parking. It's spilling out from the harbor industries out onto Allbay, but what it does is force pedestrians to be out into the traffic path. There's no adequate walkway other than when traffic is in that area. While the speed reader board improves driver courtesy, I suspect that the average traffic speed is exceeding the posted 30 kilometers per hour zone. And I have looked at Cleveland and Calvin avenues that don't have sidewalks. However, they both have parking plus 2 traffic lanes with 3 lanes total, which allows better pedestrian safety. So turning to the active transportation plan, I understand that it is complete and will not be reviewed for 5 years. However, I understand Council did defer portions of the implementation plans, and so I would encourage Council and town staff to look at some of those deferred areas. Most of the safety aspects of active transportation occur at intersections, and there are lots of engineering solutions to improve those intersections, major intersections. And by focusing on that rather than the full linear path of these projects, you could do much more to improve the safety of bicycles and pedestrians and cars. That may lead to some signalization improvements for all modes of travel, and there are still major safety concerns, or always at those major intersections of 5th, Bevan, Resthaven, and 7th Streets, as well as the major Highway 17 Beacon corridor and crossing. Right now, I view that the Beacon corridor crossing to the West Sydney is a major impediment to the movement of both pedestrians and bicyclists, and that and if that were to be a priority to connect into the new roundabout, then on to the YVR loop around, then that would be a major recreational connection for Sydney, and it would be well used. So thank you very much for your consideration and for the opportunity to speak to you this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Millburn. If you'd like to stay at the microphone for just a moment, I'm going to turn to staff on one of the comments that you've made, and also a comment that you made in your letter of correspondence that staff responded to. And so if I might turn to staff on the first, and that is, we do see at each annual budget time that there is a streetlight program that's budgeted for. It's a modest program where priorities are set by staff. Would lighting, I know a lot of those priorities are in more public areas of the downtown, but would that lighting include residential areas, or under that program, would residential areas such as the Allbay Road be considered? Ms. Clary.
Through to Mayor McNeil-Smith. Some of our areas were governed, the street lighting is governed by the spacing of the BC Hydro lights, BC Hydro poles, and this happens to be one of them. So the town uses the existing BC Hydro poles and puts our street lights on them. So to add street lights in those situations, it can be quite costly because you need a new power supply for that. But if that is something we wanted to look at, we can definitely do it. But it would not be cheap to add lights in between the hydro lights.
Thank you, Ms. Clary. Mr. Hisik.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. That annual budget is essentially an opportunity fund where we might fill in a gap where there's an existing development that's adding streetlights, and then we take the opportunity to complete the line of them, if you will. It typically is not to go into ad hoc areas and add to our streetlight inventory.
Thank you. Another item Mr. Millburn raised in his letter in the first paragraph was with the changes in the, I'm not sure what that little park is called, whether it's Bowden Park, that's part of Van Isle Marina, and that there's gravel adjacent to the roadway, and there was a comment with regards to how the weather might impact that. There's obviously going to be a point where it's private property and town property. Is there an opportunity for the town to contribute, or is that mostly the private property responsibility?
Through to the mayor, actually, the property owner that fronts that little parklet, it's private property, but they treat it as a bit of a parklet for the area. That property owner is actually going to be graveling that area here in the next year. They've actually inquired about a right-of-way permit to do that work, so I foresee that coming in very near future, getting that area graveled.
Great, thanks, Mr. Duran. Thanks again, Mr. Millburn, for your correspondence and for taking the time to come to council this evening.
Great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. I'll call for a second time if there's anyone wishing to come forward to address council this evening. Please come forward.
Thank you. Good evening, Mayor McNeil-Smith and members of council. My name is Betsy Ives, and I live at Unit 1, 9855 Rest Haven Drive. Thank you for this opportunity to speak to you about becoming politically and financially partnered with the Saanich Peninsula Healthcare Foundation and the CFUW Saanich Peninsula Club. CFUW is an acronym for Canadian Federation of University Women, and there are 93 clubs across the country. I chair the advocacy committee, and with me is Susan Lane. She's treasurer of the CFUW Saanich Peninsula Club and national treasurer of the CFUW Board of Directors, and Susan will speak to the budget. The Saanich Peninsula Club, with 70 members, will host a one-day care fair at the Mary Winspear Center, free to the public on June 6th, 2024, during BC's Seniors Week. CARE stands for Community Attachment of Resources and Engagement, where a variety of services are presented at booths in Bodine Hall. Existing resources will be invited, such as senior centers, United Way Better at Home, Shoal Center, Mount Newton Respite, and access to mobility devices, technological help, transportation services, foot care nurses, personal care aides, pharmacies, meal support services, handyman services, companion services, and also agencies like Beacon Community Volunteer Services Program, Panorama Recreation Center, and others, offering activity programs to ensure social connections. Several 40-minute workshops will be offered throughout the day by professionals, gerontologists, mental health workers, seniors healthcare professionals on topics like aging in place, dealing with stress, financial literacy, life without driving, navigating the healthcare system. These will be scheduled at specific times during the day. It is really important to understand that this is a free event to both participants and the general public, so that small local businesses can have an information booth along with larger operators. A survey will be available to attendees and participants so they can express their needs and respond to the benefits of the care fair. In closing, I'm going to quote from a book. The book title is Res Rules. There's also a subtitle. It was published in 2021 by Chief Clarence Louis, who is the Okanagan Indian Band chief. On page 270, he quotes a Native American proverb, and this is it. "Tell me the facts and I will learn. Tell me the truth and I'll believe. But tell me a story and it'll live in my heart forever." We have all heard the stories of adult sons and daughters struggling to find the appropriate care for aging parents and relatives, and then how to access the care once they've found the right support. We've all heard stories of seniors living alone who are unable to navigate the bureaucracy to find the support services that are available to them. The care fair will make communication and information more accessible through this public event. Please work with us, join us financially to help seniors find the right sources at the right time. Help strengthen structural linkages between community organizations and public health. And now I'll turn it over to Susan Lane.
Thank you, Ms. Ives. Good evening, Ms. Lane.
Hi, I'm Susan Lane. I live at 2137 Collinwood Road here in Sydney. When we sent our letter, we sent a budget, but before I just go into the numbers, why are we asking you, and we're going to ask North Saanich, and we're going to ask Central Saanich for money? And the reason is 35 to 40% of the population of the Saanich Peninsula is over 65. The numbers, there's a range, because I think the Town of Sydney website is slightly different than the Stats Canada. Even if it's only 35%, I have no idea, but there's probably quite a large percentage of caregivers who are not over 65, sons and daughters. So we are a community of seniors, as I'm sure you all know. So we're asking for your support because of that. I've worked in Sydney. I had a CPA practice here, and I volunteer in Sydney. I don't know if you have a copy of the budget with you, but it's fairly simple. We anticipate revenue of approximately $14,000 and expenses of approximately $14,000. We have asked, or we will ask, each of the 3 municipalities for $3,000. Our club is contributing $2,000. We are also getting $2,000 from the Saanich Peninsula Hospital and Healthcare Foundation. And the balance we're going to either get through sponsors or donations. And our expenses are fairly firm. We've already have a contract with Mary Winspear. We've got quotes. The biggest expense is advertising. And the other expense, of course, is at Mary Winspear, and then honorariums for our speakers. So are there any questions?
Well, thank you, Ms. Lane. I'm not sure if you were able to note that we do have your letter as correspondence, so council will be coming to that. In fact, council, I will make a motion after public participation to raise that on the agenda to the next item, given the public participants here. But so we were going to speak to the letter.
Oh, okay.
And that sort of thing. Typically, we don't have a Q&A during public participation.
Oh, okay. Sorry, didn't know
If
that.
you had any questions of us, I could direct them through to staff or provide them. But as I say, we will have a conversation we'll have a discussion with staff. And
So we should be around for that as well then.
Yeah, I do have one question, and that is, you indicated the date of the event is early June of 2024. Council has a budget process and a grants and aid process immediately following the budget process in the early spring of next year. Is there anything that would complicate the timing if a council decision were to be made at budget time or through our grants and aid program next spring?
Well, we would have to look at our budget and adjust accordingly. And it's late, but yeah.
Okay, I thought that might be the response, but I did.
We go to plan B, C, or D, yeah.
So when we come to it on the agenda, we won't be asking questions of yourselves then, but I thank you for your presentation, Ms. Ives and Ms. Lane, and as I say, we will come to it shortly.
Thank you very much, Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you. I will call for a third and final time if there's anyone else wishing to speak to council this evening. And seeing none, I'll close the public participation period. And as just indicated, I would seek a motion from council to raise item 14A to the next item on the agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. All in favor? That motion carries. And so we do have a letter of correspondence as as our guests have indicated this evening, making a request for an amount of $3,000 in support of their event. They've provided information and the budget information. Staff have made a recommendation that this be referred to our grants and aid process in 2024, which, as I indicated, is immediately following our budget process, which takes place in the early spring. We usually commence in February. I would just turn to staff for a moment if they wish to provide any comment with regards to the timing of this request and process. Mr. Hissick.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We do not have an ongoing budget throughout the year for this kind of request. We refer them all to the budget, to the grants and aid process. If it's of a significant enough magnitude, it sometimes becomes a budget item through the financial plan process, but at the $3,000 level, we believe this is a textbook grant and aid, and all that funding is spent for the year.
Okay, thank you. So I would wish to highlight for the presenters this evening that Mr. Hissick's point with regards to our budget process is an important one. So we have a lengthy budget process. Staff takes a considerable time starting in the fall into early into 2024 to prepare the 5-year financial plan for 2024, 5 years out. Of course, Council predominantly has its conversation on the 2024 budget. But we don't, after we approve the budget, so after we approved the budget earlier this year for 2023, we did not leave a pot of money out there for individuals or groups to come forward and ask for contributions. So hence my question with regards to timing, with regards to your event, and I appreciate it is perhaps a little closer than you would like, but I'm expressing my view now to Council, and I'll turn to Council colleagues in a moment, that I think it's part of our reasonable process to consider, to make the consideration of this request either at budget time or grants and aid. So I'll turn to colleagues now. I see Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. It's a great idea, and I no doubt that there's a need. I am more inclined to refer it to budget process, as staff have recommended, for the reasons you've articulated, but also perhaps to give the organizers some time. I don't know if they've consulted with the Shoals Center, so you may be interested to know that the Shoals Senior Center had an event like this in June, focused on seniors, their needs, all of the sorts of things you talked about. What are the home at care program? The RCMP come in, do sessions about fraud and online security, that sort of thing. And they just actually had an open house on Thursday for seniors and their caregivers to come and learn about the various services that are available at Shoals Center. And they also had booths set up in their big hall for other community organizations to get to some of the concerns that you're addressing. So, and also in looking at the budget, I note that, there's costs for facility rentals, that sort of thing. So I'm just, if you're gonna wait till budget time anyways, if that's the direction we go, to spend some time talking to the director of the Shoals Senior Center and see if this is something that you might be able to work together on. So if they're gonna do an event anyways, maybe you can collaborate, and maybe they can provide facilities at no cost and some other support as well. The other thing I'll add on is that date of, I believe it was June 4th, that's normally the time frame that
June 6th.
June 6th, right. It's sometime in that first week of June that we also recognize and have events for Accessibility Awareness Week. And we provide funding for the Shoals Center for that event. So they've got some funding for that. They've got other pots of funding for these senior sessions that they put on, as I've described. So just a suggestion to maybe do some consultation, collaboration with them perhaps. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. And just to add to that just briefly is Beacon Community Services, which is, I think, an organization most, if not everyone in our communities is familiar with, is does have a contract to operate the Shoal Center as a senior center for our community and beyond our community. And having attended some of their functions, most recently a volunteer appreciation lunch where 250 volunteers were recognized. The list of programs that the Shoal Center provides for the seniors community is extensive. It's actually grown since the pandemic, and there's been some ongoing funding since the pandemic. And they have I think the largest contact list, for their variety of their programs with our seniors community, not only in Sydney but of course on the peninsula. So just to add to some of Councillor O'Keefe's suggestions. I'll turn to colleagues. Is there any further comments? Seeing none. We do have the recommendation that staff have provided if a councillor wishes to. Councillor Rintoul.
I'll move that the request from CFUW be referred to the 2024 grants and aid process.
Second.
Moved by Councillor Rintoul and seconded by Councillor Garnett. Councillor Rintoul.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Thank you very much for coming forward, and as has been summarized, in terms of the process and timing, you're ahead of the 8 ball here. You're out early, which is a good thing. I think it resonated with all of us that the subject matter is going to be of great interest to the community. I think you mentioned that in your presentation. You're very correct. So I wish you the best in the planning process, and I look forward to seeing the application during the grants and aid process. Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. And so, Councillor Garnett, seeing no further discussion, I'll call a question. All in favor? The motion carries unanimous. Thank you again, ladies.
Thank you.
We'll now turn to section 6 on the agenda, which is development permits and development variance permits. And the 6A is development variance permit application number DV 100342 at 10129 5th Street to increase the maximum height of fences, retaining walls, in order to legalize existing developments. Council did discuss this at a previous meeting, and we did direct staff to provide notification to neighboring residents. As of the council agenda being published, we had no submissions, but as indicated during approval of the agenda this evening, we did receive a piece of correspondence from Ms. Quantes regarding the variance application, and I would turn to colleagues if they wish to comment or make a recommendation and then provide comment. Councillor Garnett.
I'll make a recommendation if there's nobody that wants to comment.
Please go ahead.
I'll move that the development variance be approved.
Second.
We have it moved by Councillor Garnett and seconded by Councillor Duncan. Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just speak to the only piece of correspondence we received. And very familiar with this area and visited it to look at it. And as far as the rear yard, the east fence goes, I can understand full well why the developer wanted it there, and actually probably benefits the people in Roberts Manor as well, just from a privacy perspective. And as far as the south fence goes, the neighbors at 10,121 5th Street were wanting this to be done. And to be honest with you, the previous house had a quite steep driveway that went right along the wall. I think they had a retaining wall there previously. So from my perspective, you can't even notice a difference really. And since the people that live right next door to it are in favor of it and want to see this happen for their own privacy, I have no problem supporting it.
Thank you, Councillor Garnett. I'll turn to Councillor Duncan.
I have nothing to add.
Thank you. Thank you, councillors. I'll just add that, as Councillor Garnett indicated, that when the applicant came forward and they explained that at the time of the development, the neighboring strata to the south came forward and they came to an agreement whereby this design was come upon and agreed amongst the parties. Can certainly appreciate that this is a variance and there would be some concern. And the point noted in the letter of correspondence was that a green separation, a hedge or of something of that nature, might be preferred. And I would agree that would be an ideal solution. But as was presented to council, there's a change of elevation between the adjoining properties, and I think that might present a challenge of sorts. So I think we've addressed certainly the concerns this evening, Council, and is there any further discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? And that carries unanimous. Thank you. We're now turning to item 6B, which is Development Variance Permit Application Number DV100343 at 9490 Maryland Drive to reduce minimum rear yard setback in order to legalize a structure under construction. Again, we discussed at a previous council meeting, notification was provided to nearby residents. We've had no submissions as of this meeting, and we do have a recommendation. Councillor Duncan.
I'll move that the development variance be approved.
I'll second it.
Moved by Councillor Duncan, seconded by Councillor Novick. Councillor Duncan?
No, we discussed this last time. There were no letters, and it's an odd-shaped lot where the variance doesn't really impact anybody negatively, so I see no problem with moving forward with it.
Thank you. Councillor Novick?
Nothing to add.
Seeing no further discussion, I'll call a question. All in favor? The motion carries unanimous. Thank you. We're now turning to adoption of our regular minutes of our regular council meeting on August 21st. If I could have a mover, please.
Move adoption of the minutes.
Second.
We have it moved and seconded. Any corrections? Seeing none, all in favor? That motion carries. Thank you. We're now turning to the next item. Our agenda is under committee reports, and under item 12A, we have the minutes of the Emergency Planning Committee meeting on June 21st. Councillor Novick is our liaison to that committee, and we do not require a motion to receive the minutes as they are on our agenda, but I will turn to Councillor Novick if there was anything you wish to highlight in those minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It was a pretty standard meeting, and the minutes that you see before you are quite representative of what took place, so I have nothing really to add.
Thank you. I'll turn to Councillor Duncan.
Oh, thank you. I'd had a question. I forgot to email staff about it. There is a note for the roundtable. Ms. Gilmayer brought up that the town anticipated hearing tomorrow whether they'd been successful in the sea level rise adaptation grant. So did we get that?
Turn to staff.
Yeah.
We're seeing a nod or a yes from Ms. Clary. Ms. Clary?
Yes, we were successful in that grant.
Okay, thank you. Good to hear.
Thank you for the good news. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, I'll turn to the next item on our agenda. Under 12B, we have the minutes of our Committee of the Whole meeting of September 5th. I'll turn to Councillor Novick, who is chair of that meeting, in just a moment to take us through the recommendations, but are there any errors or any corrections within the minutes? Seeing none, I'll call upon Councillor Novick to take us through the 5 recommendations, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The first recommendation is regarding a zoning amendment, application number RZ100107 and development permit number DP100841 for 2060 White Birch Road to construct a 4-story, 60-unit, multi-unit residential apartment building while retaining the existing marina use. The recommendation approved by Committee of the Whole is that zoning amendment application number RZ100107 and development permit number DP100841 for the property at 2060 White Birch Road be forwarded to the Advisory Planning Commission for further review and comment, subject to the following conditions. 1, that prior to review by the Advisory Planning Commission, the applicant submit a traffic impact assessment prepared by a qualified professional, and 2, that the applicant submit a variance application to reduce the eastern lot line setback from 1 meter to 0.6 meters for surface parking.
Do we have a seconder?
Second?
Seconded by Councillor Duncan. Councillor Novick?
We had quite extensive discussion on this, as I'm sure you recall. This is a big item for council. While it just did barely get by, well, I shouldn't say barely got by, but it did get by. There was a lot of discussion, and it was decided that this should go to the next step to the Advisory Planning Commission with those recommended studies before making any final decisions on it. And I think that's the appropriate route to take for this.
Thank you, Councillor Novak. Councillor Duncan?
Yeah, thank you. I really have nothing to add to what Councillor Novak said. I did have a question for staff following, that just kind of arises from the point one, though.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, we don't specify what the boundaries of the traffic impact assessment will be. Do we know which roads would definitely be included, or is that something that part of the initial scoping that a consultant would do?
Thank you. Through the mayor to Councillor Duncan, I understand it is part of the initial scoping of the project by the consultant selected by the applicant. The intent of a traffic impact analysis like this is to look at what impact the proposed development would have on traffic in the area.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was just wondering whether we needed to specify, because I know we'll hear from neighbors about Rest Haven, but then also probably the McDonald and Ardwell routes as well. And I don't know how far they would go with that, if we need to specify that, or if that's something that they would probably include just based on the types of conversations that came out of it.
Yeah, thank you. I think if a report is submitted that staff do not feel is sufficient, then we would ask for it to be revised.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the question, Councillor Duncan. I have a question arising before I turn to colleagues, and that is a question through to staff is, I don't know if there is a precedent for this, but within this motion, if we were to pass an amendment whereby the terms of reference of the traffic study be approved by staff, would staff have concerns with that? I think the motion indicates that it will be the responsibility of the applicant to pay for and retain the consultant, but with the experience that our staff would have with regards to traffic within our community, would staff see that as a benefit, or is there a precedence for that? Ms. Verhagen?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. I think it's implicit in the recommendation that's here on the table, that staff review the terms of reference in a traffic study like this when it's submitted. And if staff do not feel that they've covered enough, then we would communicate that back to the applicant. They'd have to revise.
Okay.
So I think it's included in there.
Thank you. I'll turn to colleagues, Councillor Novak, then Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And as a follow-up to that, or along the same lines, when we talk about a traffic impact assessment, there was a lot of discussion raised by the public, and both historically and in the most recent iteration of this, about parking, impacts on parking in that area. Would the traffic study necessarily, or traffic impact assessment necessarily, include a study of parking issues?
Ms. Verhagen?
Yes, thank you. Through the mayor to Councillor Novak. Usually it includes both traffic and parking. If council wants to be clear that you would like to hear about traffic and parking, you could add that to the wording of the recommendation here.
So a suggestion, thank you, Ms. Verhagen. A suggestion is that the motion, that part of the motion reads, the applicant submit a traffic impact. It could be amended to say submit a traffic and parking impact assessment, but I'll leave that to council's discretion. Councillor Novak, you have the floor.
I would like to make that recommendation, or at least that amendment to the motion, that the item number 2 read that the applicant submit a variance application to reduce, item number 1 in the recommendation, that prior to review by the APC, the applicant submit a traffic and parking impact assessment prepared by qualified professionals.
Okay, before looking for a seconder, Mr. Hissick did have his hand. Mr. Hissick?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd be very concerned about adding parking to this because there are no parking variances involved with this application. I think any look at parking would not be able to isolate this one particular development in terms of overall impact in area parking. I think it's next to impossible to determine where the impact come from, whether it's the existing developments or this one. this one is not asking for a parking variance. It would seem overly onerous to hold them to task for that purpose.
Thank you, Mr. Hisik. I'll ask the mover to consider that staff input, and if you wish to continue with your motion, moving that recommendation.
I understand, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I understand Mr. Hisik's concerns. However, this is one of the big concerns of the residents of the area. And if such a study is going to be done, then any professional looking at it would look at a before and after scenario. For example, they would study the parking
Okay,
considerations today.
you're motivating
Okay.
Mr. Novik, or Councillor Novik, and what I'll do is, I just wanted to ask if you,
Okay.
having heard staff's input, whether you wish to continue. If you do, I'll then look for a seconder. Do we have a seconder for discussion? We have Councillor.
I will second that.
Okay, I'll allow you now to continue to
Thank you.
motivate Councillor Novik.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, as I said earlier, I think parking is a major issue for the residents of the area, and I don't see any reason why, if a study is going to be done of the traffic and or parking, that a before and after scenario can't be promulgated. I think it's important to council to understand the implications of adding a relatively large residential project in that area with a limited number of parking spaces, with the knowledge that very often today families have multiple vehicles, and anything more than one in that complex is likely to end up on the street. Coupled with marina parking, which, as the proponent stated last week, may or may not be enough. I'm not sure that 35 spaces is enough for the marina at peak periods, but I'd like for council to have all that information at hand when making a final decision. It's one thing to speculate now. That doesn't do us much good. But I think that if we're going to go and ask the proponent to study, then they should come back with a sufficient study that council has enough data to actually make solid decisions on.
Thank you, Councillor Novik. I'll turn to Councillor O'Keefe, the seconder.
Thank you. So I just, first of all, in regards to the,
Okay, we're speaking to the amendment.
yes,
Okay.
okay. So in regards to the amendment, so for the parking, to me, I'm not, whether or not they have applied for a variance or not is not, it's relevant, but I think the more important thing is how, to me, traffic and parking go hand in hand. And when I listened to the applicants last time, when we talked about concern about traffic on White Birch Road, and because it was a narrow road, well, one of the things that they were talking about was, well, maybe council should take parking away, say that there's not going to be any parking on White Birch Road. So to me, they're looking at the parking and the traffic is related. It is one of the biggest things that I think that residents had brought up. As a councillor, it's information that I'd like to have in making my decision to find out really what is the impact. Maybe the study will come back and say, yeah, we don't anticipate that this will be an issue, but if it is, I think it's incumbent upon us as council, when we are making such a change to the neighborhood, that we make sure that we have all the information that we can to make sure that we can take steps if necessary to mitigate any negative impacts to the surrounding community.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. I'm going to, before going to colleagues, pose a question to staff, and that is there precedence, appreciating, and this council is aware of the parking study that was done earlier this year in the downtown, that council received a report and recommendations. Excuse me. Is there precedence for parking studies in residential neighborhoods in Sydney. Mr. Newcomb.
Thank you. In 2018, I believe, council directed staff to undertake a multifamily parking study, and briefly the results of that found that there was approximately 1 vehicle per dwelling unit in apartment buildings in Sydney.
Thank you, Mr. Newcomb. I'll turn to colleagues before speaking myself. I'll turn to Councillor Garnett, then Councillor Duncan.
Thank you, Mayor. I guess upon leaving the meeting last week and reflecting on comments that Councillor Rintoul had made with regarding to the marina parking, I had been at the site, I guess, 2 days prior to yourself, and I went back again this week. And there are a lot of cars parked on there. There's very large RV, smaller RVs, trailers, storage trailers. There's a lot on that parking lot. And I guess to speak to the concerns that Councillor Rintoul raised, I didn't feel that the applicant's answers regarding what would happen to those that particular parking aspect was adequately answered. So that is a problem for me. And although I'm not as concerned about the residential component, because as we've had a study on in the past, indicates the parking would be pretty much bang on based on what the study showed, I do have some reservations about the marina aspect of the parking, and that's why this particular development is different. It's not just the building, it's also the marina, it composes the same area. So I'll just leave it there for just to put that thought out there, and that's just something that I've been reflecting on during the past week. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Garnett. I'll turn to Councillor Duncan and then myself.
Thank you. I was going to say what Mr. Newcomb had said, that we already had done a parking study specifically to look at how many parking spaces we needed in multifamily units, and specifically I believe it tied into doing the bylaw update. And so we have this data, and every time we do a parking study we have this data, and the consultants always bring this data forward whenever they come up with these recommendations. And the problem is that the public never believes it, and and it's never people who live in apartment buildings who come and make the assertion either, that people who rent and live in apartment buildings are gonna have more cars. There are always people who live in single family homes. I know when I lived in an apartment building, we didn't ever, I mean, most of the time we didn't even get a dedicated space, and yet this is how apartment buildings work. And so I don't know how much data we could actually collect that would change the outcome, because the public will continue to make the assertion because the data isn't what they're using to make their assertion, right? They're not using, you know, either lived experience as like a residential or a rental property, a person who lives in a rental property, and they're not making the assertion based on the data that we've already collected specific to our town or even regionally that was used for our parking study. And so our consultant, we can pay again for this to come back, and they're gonna say, based on what we already know from regional analysis, what we already know from local analysis, and what we know from this building and the fact that they've set aside parking based on the bylaws, which is supposed to meet the demand for a building, which is based on previous studies, and they're gonna say, this should have no impact on parking. And the public is gonna say, no, we don't believe this, yes it will, your consultant is wrong. And so I think, I don't know how to get out of this. I also don't believe that this landowner is responsible for where other people are gonna park their stuff when he no longer provides the service. Right now, he's a business owner, and he's a landowner, and he has a parking lot space, so he's renting it out to people to park their additional vehicles, or possibly the vehicles they live in. He would like to change the use of his land and offer a different service instead. Where those people go to obtain that service from another business owner is not his problem. Just like if I ran a dry cleaner and I decided to close it, where those people would then get their clothes dry cleaned is not my problem, right? He's not obligated to make sure that somebody else will provide parking space for other people's additional vehicles. If they can no longer find it legally, I guess they might have to sell their additional vehicles. If they live in them, then I guess that's why we're trying to build this additional housing, right? Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Duncan. I'll turn to Councillor Duck. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mayor. I believe in the staff report, and staff reported back that the parking on this application meets all the requirements of both the marina and the residential units. So I'm not in favor of this amendment to the motion because I think the parking needs have been defined and met by the applicant and don't need further evaluation. And I think Councillor Duncan has said it very clearly that it's not the responsibility of the applicant to figure out where people are parking. He will provide the parking as he needs to for the development permit application. The other part of this is that some of those marina users are not necessarily in the marina. They're in anchored boats offshore, which is a whole different kettle of fish because the marina operator can't regulate who comes ashore there and happens to park or use that parking lot. So I'm not going to support this amendment and will not move forward with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Duck. I'll turn to Councillor O'Toole and myself.
Thank you, Mayor. My initial take and the response from staff on this was that in all likelihood we would see as part of the traffic study parking implications considered, in part because it's a fairly narrow roadway with parking on both sides in some sections. And so I really hadn't thought of this as being a significant change to the motion. I do feel like, notwithstanding Councillor Duncan's comments, the local community probably wants to see us ask this question about parking in hopes to get some clarity, and quite frankly, the developer may even want the opportunity to have those findings shared with us. And so I really don't think this request is a big stretch from what I would have been expecting at any rate. So I'm currently leaning towards supporting the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor O'Toole. With all members of council having spoken for a first time, my comments are as follows. As has been indicated, the applications from the proponent meet all town parking requirements under our parking and loading bylaw for both the marina and the development. And while we can appreciate residents having a concern over traffic and parking impacts, while I appreciate that not all current members of council would have heard this because the applicant did come forward with a proposal last term, but in answering questions from the community and council, there are vehicles parked now in that parking lot that are not properly part of the marina per se, and the proponent indicated that those vehicles would no longer be accommodated. It would just be the marina users who would do that. So I don't know that speaking to the current parking on the lot necessarily has relevance, although I do appreciate the observations. While I think it's easy to say and sounds reasonable to say that we like to have all possible data available to us when making a decision, it's what will the data actually be with regards to the impact on the residential parking on White Birch from this development, say out to Rest Haven. We did hear a member of the public come forward last meeting and speak to how if a vehicle, there is parking permitted on both sides of the road on White Birch in places, and when that does occur, it means that cars, as in some other locations in Sydney, one has to give the way to the other to pass. That's not uncommon in certain parts of our community. It is a safety concern, but usually the neighborhood adjusts appropriately with speed and so on, courtesy. So, and the suggestion came from the resident that perhaps in one section we might consider removing the parking on one side to create more safety. Well, of course, that might have implications with regards to parking availability. So I'm not sure what the expectation of council would be in terms of, are we looking for the consultant to determine the exact number of parking spaces on White Birch and then do a time study as we had done in the downtown and present that information? The other is what assumptions would a traffic and parking consultant make with regards to what the additional parking on White Birch will be from these 60 residential units? It's going to make an assumption that X number of people don't have a car and X number of people have 2 cars. And so I'm not sure what information, you know, is going to be valuable to come back to council with regards to parking impacts. So I think that I believe that the proponent is listening to the concerns of residents, and that given they're tasked with doing this study, that if they feel in discussing with the consultant that they can provide relevant information with regards to parking impacts along with traffic impacts, they would bring that forward, because it would be in their interest to do so. But I won't support this amendment because I'm not really clear what information I would expect to see back from such a study. I'll turn to any councillors who wish to speak for a second time, and then we'll call the question. Councillor Novick.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just one thing to add to the comments, and I respect everybody's position on this. Two issues with regard to parking. Number one, access for emergency vehicles. I'm concerned that on a fairly narrow road like White Birch, if it does get more than current share of parking on that space or in those spaces, that it may at some point in the future or at peak periods inhibit the flow of emergency vehicles should they be needed, number one. Number two, the proponent last week mentioned that they're not 100% certain that they'll be able to maintain this development as rental, and left open the possibility that at some point in the future, and for all I know could be the near future, this becomes converted to strata units. And if it does become converted to strata units, then the demographic may change, and that change in demographic may impact the number of vehicles that need to be accommodated either in the building's parking or on the various side streets surrounding it. So I think it's worthwhile for council to have, once we're doing a traffic impact study, I think it's worthwhile to add the parking component to it, because it is a unique area of Sydney. It's a dead end. Access is going to be critical once that new building is up. And I know we can't hold the building off forever, but we can perhaps influence the design and the amplitude of this building. So again, I urge you to allow the amendment to go through as stated. I think it will really help us make our decisions in the long run.
Thank you, Councillor Novick. I do want to raise a point and perhaps give staff an opportunity to comment. I think Councillor Novick raising a concern with regards to congestion on White Birch and that possibly affecting emergency services. I think staff in their presentations to council and reports have indicated that both on site with the shared roadway that leads into the site, that staff do not have concerns with emergency vehicle access. And I think you know, if a council member is expressing a concern, it's contrary to what staff have presented to council to date. I'll give staff an opportunity if they wish to comment. Ms. Verhagen.
Thank you. Through the mayor to Councillor Novick. I can't recall any specific comments made by our fire department at the Development Review Committee meeting for this application expressing concerns about lack of access on White Birch Road for emergency vehicles. This development would only be improving the frontage directly adjacent to the property at the eastern end of White Birch Road, putting in that cul-de-sac turnaround like was discussed at length previously. But I can't speak for the fire department, but I don't recall any comments coming from them. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Verhagen. And I'll now turn to, if we have a speaker for a second, another speaker for a second time, Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. In regards to some of the comments made in the parking study, I recognize that, yes, we've had parking studies done in the past, and the consultants come up with you need point, you know, whatever spaces per unit, and that's based on regional and other factors. What I'm looking for in this is not that stuff. When I talk about a parking impact for this neighborhood, is not looking at what are the ratios in other areas or something, but specifically, how would the impact of the marina, what that tight little area, the impact of that, all the other surrounding things. So something that's more specific. It might also indicate that, yep, there's going to be more parking required, and it's not necessarily, I agree that it's not necessarily the responsibility of the developer. You know, we've got guidelines in terms of what they've got to do, but it might impact what, inform us on what we need to do in that area to mitigate it for residents. So for example, if the parking study comes back and says, yep, there's gonna be more cars here, more parking, but you've got room on both sides of the street so people can park there. Well, if the impact then of that is that if you've got vehicles on both sides, then I don't know how that impacts emergency vehicles or not. So I think there's enough kind of uniqueness about this area for us to take a look at it. Maybe we, as a result of the parking study, we put something in there about parking for residents only on the street. I don't know. But at least it gives us the opportunity to go into it with eyes open and know what we might have to do to mitigate the impact. So I'm happy to support the motion, the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. I'll turn to Councillor Duck for a second time.
I'm going to continue not to support this amendment. Staff have indicated to us that the proponent is providing all the parking required for the application and the development. It is not the responsibility of the proponent to take care of parking on White Birch. That is a town issue, and if we do a parking study afterwards, that's great, but the proponent isn't going to be responsible for who and where they park on White Birch. And if that becomes a problem, then yeah, maybe we look down the road at that. But you have 3 other developments in that border on White Birch there too, 4 actually, that are going to be using that as parking lots or are already using that for parking. So why are we putting and encumbering the proponent to go out and do a study at his expense to determine how White Birch is being parked well or not well? I mean, other parts of that is there's a hedge on White Birch. How far is that encumbering onto the road? Should that be trimmed back so there could be more parking? There are too many things here for the proponent to have to take care of that the town should be looking at if it becomes an issue. The proponent in his application has indicated, and the staff have indicated, that he is meeting all the parking needs for both the marina and the residents. So I think we don't need any further effort on his part to study parking in the area. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Duck. I'll turn to Councillor Duncan for a second time.
Thank you. I think just because obviously this is going to come back to council again, another thing we need to make clear, in addition to what Councillor Duck just said, is that it is not the town's job to plan to accommodate people who abuse the commons. Councillor Duck pointed out that a number of those people who might be parking cars on Rest Haven and the surrounding area are the people who are anchored way offshore. They're not people who are parked in the marina and the legal boat slips. There's some of those people, I think we heard before once, there's 30 legal buoys out there, but there's over 100 boats. It is not our job to plan to build infrastructure or make decisions on building new housing in our community because other people might be illegally, basically abusing the commons by parking their cars to access their illegally parked boats. Or that other people, when they have so much money, they don't know what else to do with it, decide to have 1 car per person in a retired couple living in a condo, and they're gonna keep their extra car on the street, where it becomes a problem for the rest of the neighborhood because they can't give up that car. And they can't figure out, you know, a way to store it legally or in a way that doesn't abuse the commons. Not our problem. Our job is to plan for how we build things, for assuming that our residents are going to be following the laws and are not going to be doing things to deliberately or carelessly make things worse for the neighborhood that they choose to live in. To say we're gonna look at this as though he's gonna change, you know, how people who are already abusing the commons by parking on that street are then gonna change their behavior. Oh, that's not my problem. If it becomes difficult for them to park on the street, they can park somewhere else so they can reevaluate their lifestyles. It's not his job to, you know, lose a development opportunity. It's not our job to lose a housing opportunity, and it's not our job to talk about how we might change the way we design roadways to accommodate those people. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Duncan. I'll turn to Councillor Rintoul for a second time.
Thank you, Mayor. You know, I think I would concur with Councillor Duck's comments had it not been for the fact that this is a rezoning. And so if we weren't looking to rezone the property, which is, you know, currently enabled to build, I think it's 37 units on the property, and looking at the potential for 60, you know, really investigating parking as it may impact the flow of traffic on a small residential roadway is I think where I continue to see merit in this. So I'll leave my comments there. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rintoul. Seeing no further discussion, I'm calling now the question on the amendment to add the word traffic within the
Parking.
to add the word parking after traffic in the impact assessment. All in favor? Opposed? Councillor Duck, Councillor Duncan, Councillor Garnett, and myself are opposed. The motion, the amendment is defeated. So we're now back to the main motion, Council. Is there any further discussion? Councillor Rintoul.
Thank you, Mayor. If you give me the latitude, it may just will be a clarification that I, you know, may come from the chair, but you know, the mover made the statement that this barely got by, and I would like viewers who may be watching later and not have the benefit of the staff report or the minutes of the previous meeting to understand that this was carried by a vote of 6-1. So it was well supported in terms of moving forward as suggested in the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rintoul. Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Mayor. I will continue to support the motion, but I do have concerns from something that happened in the or came out in the last meeting, and that's the rental purchase kind of distinction. And the only thing I would say just going forward is that my preference would be one or the other. I'm not comfortable. I'm not thrilled with the idea that the intention is, because intention leads the door to all kinds. I spoke to it last time, and I won't belabor the point, but just having some kind of, either it's a condo building or some kind of term of rental. I just fear for, as I said before, for the potential tenants living in, when is this building maybe going to turn over? And I would not feel comfortable putting people, if we went forward with this, putting people in a position where they may have to vacate and find other housing where the options are very limited in our region and in our city or town. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Garnett. Any other speakers on or discussion on the main motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? One opposed, Councillor O'Keefe. The motion carries. Thank you. Councillor Novick, I would ask you to continue with recommendation under 12BR2.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The second recommendation put forth by Committee of the Whole last week was that the following correspondence be forwarded to Council when the item comes back to Council. Item number 1, email from K. Denard, dated July 17th, 2023, and number 2, email from S. Cloza, dated September 3rd, 2023. And we will add to that a recently arrived email from J. Cook, dated September 5th, 2023.
Thank you. Do we have a seconder?
Second.
Seconded by Councillor Garnett. Any comment, Councillor Novick?
Nothing to add.
Thank you. Any discussion? Seeing none, I'll call a question. All in favor? The motion carries unanimous. Thank you. And to recommendation 3, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And the third recommendation by Committee of the Whole was Development Variance Permit Application Number DV 100341 at 10386 Allbay Road to legalize the non-conforming driveway that exceeds the allowable proportion of impermeable parking area in the front yard. The recommendation is that owners and tenants in occupation of property within 75 meters or 246 feet of 10386 Allbay Road be notified regarding development variance application number DV 100341 to relax the maximum percentage of impermeable vehicle parking area in the front yard from 30% to 38%, and that any written correspondence received be forwarded to Council at the time of consideration of approval of the variance. So moved.
We have it moved and seconded by Councillor O'Toole. I'll turn to Councillor Novick.
There was a lot of discussion on this. This was the one, and Councillor O'Toole is absolutely correct. I erred in my comment on the previous agenda item. This was the one that just squeaked by. I think, again, this is one of those cases where the variance is in order, because if you look at the aerial view of those 4 properties that were all developed at approximately the same time, all the driveways are identical. The big difference is that the lots are somewhat differently shaped, and this is one of those situations that the development variance permit process was designed for, to allow for a consistent view from the front of the property, notwithstanding the fact that the rear of the property might be somewhat irregularly shaped. And in this case, I think it's appropriate that we allow this to go ahead when it finally does come to council. So I would like to see it move to the next step, where the public in the immediate vicinity of that address are notified. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Novick. Just before turning to colleagues for possible further discussion, this was a split vote, 4-3 at our meeting last week, and I do appreciate the reviews on both sides, and it would be a little repetitious to go through. If there's a councillor who's considered changing their vote, they may wish to speak to that, but I would highlight that the motion is actually to provide notification to nearby residents to provide input. And I think, if nothing else, council can certainly express their views on this with the input, any possible input that comes forward from residents. So I'll just make that comment, but leave it open to colleagues to continue discussion. Seeing no, Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Mayor. I just have a question of staff, because I'm still a bit perplexed by all of it, to be honest. So I'm hoping staff can enlighten me to some degree, because 2 years ago was a long time, although I did go back and look at the minutes and saw that it was denied and the motion was unanimous from all of council at the time. So correct me if I'm wrong, or fill in the blanks for me, there were 2 applications originally. I believe one was to make their driveway 60%. You can only have 50, and they wanted to move it to 60, and the other was the impermeable 30 to 38. And we denied the entire, and so I guess I'm having, if this 30 to 38 that we're talking about here is exactly the same as what the initial variance request, one of the initial variance requests was, or is it different in any way? I know you talked about a difference in the way that driveway was measured, but I thought that pertained to the 60 to 50, not to the actual permeable, impermeable percentages. Because the numbers seem to be exactly the same. Sorry, the numbers seem to be exactly the same from the initial application and in this one. So I'm trying to glean from this what's different about it. Like, I'm having a hard time understanding why there's any difference.
Thank you, Councillor Garnett. I'll turn to Ms. Verhagen.
Thank you. Through the mayor to Councillor Garnett. Sorry, excuse me. The original application was for a development variance application in 2021. Excuse me.
Okay.
The application was to increase the overall driveway area, combined permeable and impermeable materials in the front yard from the maximum 50% to 60%.
Yeah.
And within that, increase the maximum impermeable area from 30 to 38%. So staff's recommendation on that report back in 2021 was to reduce the overall driveway area from 60% to 50% by reducing the amount of permeable pavers, and then to continue with the notification for the driveway, the impermeable driveway, from 30 to 38%. So council's decision at that time was to deny the application outright. So this is, yeah, as you said, this is a new variance application. Be happy to answer any other questions. Does that answer your question?
To some degree, I'm just...
So if I can interject for a moment, I appreciate everything Ms. Verhagen has just said, but this application is, this variance application does not include a variance from 50% to 60%.
Oh, I'm aware of that, yeah.
So that is how this application differs from the first application. Is the first application was for 2 parts to the variance, and this application is for 1 part.
Yeah, no, I'm clear on that.
I'll let you go ahead with what clarification you're seeking.
Well, it just seems to me that there's, in the one that's coming forward now, was part of the original one as well, and I don't see any difference distinguishing from that portion of the original application to this application. It's considered new because it doesn't have that other overlaying portion of it, but within it is the 30 to 38. Is that still the same as what it was in the original application, is what I'm trying to understand?
Yes, it is still the same. That part to legalize the existing impermeable driveway, the concrete part of the driveway, from 30 to 38%. That element is the same as from the original application in 2021.
Okay, so in all essence, it's different in the sense that they just eliminated one of the asks from the original application. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Garnett. I'll turn to Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. I had the same issue as Councillor Garnett on this, and with some correspondence earlier in the day with staff, my understanding of the situation is that the essence of the variance now and the essence of the variance then, they're the same. It's, if you look at what we rejected 2 years ago, it's exactly the same as what we're approving today with that other sort of stuff, which, but to me is not really germane to this. However, what I understand from staff is that in our land use bylaw, there is nothing that restricts a variant applicant from coming forward again. And so whether my understanding from our corporate officer, correct me if I'm wrong, is that even if everything was the same, without that extra little bit about the patio, that even if everything was exactly the same as 2 years ago, they would still be able to bring forward the variance application again for the same thing, because there's nothing in our land use bylaw that prohibits them from doing that, is the way I understood that. And maybe I'll look to staff and our corporate officer to just clarify that understanding is correct.
I'll turn to Mr. Hissick or Ms. Nelson.
Thank you, Councillor. In a sense, that's correct. We probably should set a time limit for this kind of thing, but in all honesty, it doesn't occur very frequently. We don't deal with a lot of after-the-fact variances. There are some, but not many. And if it was simply the same application back again, you would probably get a similar recommendation from staff on how to treat it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. I'll turn to Councillor Duck.
Yeah, I want to thank Councillor Garnett and Councillor O'Keefe because they've summarized the points I wanted to make, because I'm concerned here that council 2 years ago voted unanimously to deny this application. And yet here we are 2 years later, and as has been well defined, no substantial change, just a new application. And I'm concerned for my colleagues on council who voted against this 2 years ago are now voting for it. If they could determine or define what has changed their minds, because maybe it'll help me understand and change my mind. But right now, I'm not in favor of supporting this variance. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Duck, and I appreciate what you've raised, and I will speak to that because it was an impact in my vote 2 years ago, and that is the application that came forward 2 years ago was to increase the impermeable, as we know, and is repeated to this variance application, from 30 to 38%. But the second part of the variance request was to increase the impermeable area from 50 to 60%. And I can recall having a concern over approving impermeable surface area of 60% of the property from our bylaw of 50%. So the staff recommendation, as Mr. Hagan indicated this evening, 2 years ago, was actually to deny that aspect, the 50 to 60%, and was to send it out to resident notification with regards to impermeable portion of 30 to 38. So this application is different for me than it was last time. I'm not considering an application to go to 50 to 60% impermeable surface in the front yard area. I'm only considering the impermeable surface of 30 to 38%. And I spoke to that last meeting, and I'm supportive of that for both the very small impact of the area, relative area, and the potential hardship on the applicants, for the applicant. I'll leave my comments there and turn to colleagues. Councillor O'Keefe.
Yeah, just a question through you to staff. So staff, my understanding is this is somewhat of a, I don't know if you want to call it a loophole in terms of there being no limit on when an individual can bring forward the same variance request, even though it was denied.
I'm sorry, I'm gonna call a point of order here. We are not considering the same application. You're speaking of a hypothetical that we are considering an application today that is identical to the application 2 years ago. We're not. And so I don't see the benefit of speaking to that hypothetical.
I was just can I ask
Please, go ahead.
A question? So I guess it would be more a motion arising.
Well, you've made comment with regards to a loophole.
Well, I guess
I'm not appreciating what loophole there is. This application is different this time than it was last time.
What I'm saying is that staff made the comment that the reason that this can come forward is because we don't have a process in place to prohibit individuals from bringing things forward, and that's something that we should address. And so my question was just going to be, do they require guidance from us, say as a motion arising tonight, to address that because they said something should be done, or whether that's something that would come in the course of the update of the zoning bylaw and then the land use bylaw? So do they need any further direction from us in regards to that? Thank you.
I'll turn to Ms. Verhagen.
Thank you. Recently, earlier in 2023, Council considered a staff report about amending Land Use Procedures Bylaw 1380 regarding the 10 or more properties owned by 10 or more people rule for public notification for zoning and OCP amendments, if you can recall that discussion. So Council's resolution then was for us to draft an amendment to the bylaw regarding that matter. This issue of putting in a time limit, more like establishing a minimum time that must pass before somebody can reapply for the same thing upon which council has made a decision. That same bylaw is the one that we would put such a regulation into, the Land Use Procedures Bylaw 1380. So we could bring forward an amendment about this, like putting in a time limit or a minimum time within which somebody cannot reapply for the same thing, for council's consideration in that, as part of that amendment. I'll turn to Mr.
Okay,
Hussain.
I mean,
Yeah,
I think this is more fitting of a motion discussion arising, but since since it started, I'll allow it to continue, rather than dealing with the motion on the floor. But I'll turn to Mr. Hissick and then I have a comment to make.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The hard part will be making that determination. Is this the same variance or not? I mean, just judging by the discussion tonight.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Hissick, and that's my point, is that I do appreciate that that council and staff may wish to review this bylaw and put in provisions, a timeline provision for an application that is the same. But as we've indicated this evening, this is not the same application, and I think if that provision was in the land use bylaws, that it might not pertain to this particular application because it's not the same. I'll turn to Ms. Verhagen.
Thank you. Following this, or as part of this, it's important to note that the section of the Local Government Act that talks about these development approval procedures is Section 460 of the Local Government Act, provincial legislation. It does say if a bylaw under subsection 1 that gives local governments the power to adopt a bylaw about these land use procedures, if a bylaw under that section establishes a time limit for reapplication, the time limit may be varied in relation to a specific reapplication by an affirmative vote of at least 2/3 of the local government members eligible to vote on the reapplication. So that means even if we put this in the bylaw, in bylaw 1380, an applicant could come back the next day and reapply and ask council to waive the to vary the time limit. So it's not, putting a time limit in the bylaw wouldn't be a fail-safe to prevent this from happening. People are still allowed to apply and to ask for that time limit to be relaxed, and that would be a council decision too.
Thanks, Ms. Verhagen. I'll turn to Councillor Rintoul.
Thank you. As a point of privilege, I would like to ask the chair to call the question.
Okay, do we have a seconder?
Second.
Second, all in favor? Motion carries. So without further discussion, I'll call the question. I just want to see the motion again. I'll call the question. All in favor?
Point of order.
Yes.
You didn't ask if anybody was opposed to that point of privilege?
Thank you, Councillor Garnett, for your point of order, and I will now finish calling the question. And is there anyone opposed to calling the question? Councillor Garnett is opposed. The motion to call the question carries 6-1. My apologies, Councillor Garnett. I'll now call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Councillor Duck is opposed. Councillor Garnett is opposed. Councillor O'Keefe is opposed. The motion carries. Thank you. I'm now turning back to Councillor Novick, our liaison, to proceed with recommendation 4 from the committee minutes of the committee of the whole meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And the recommendation number 4 from the committee of the whole meeting of last week is for development variance permit application number DV100344 at 2306 Beacon Avenue, and I so move to allow an existing ground floor commercial unit to be occupied for office use fronting onto Beacon Avenue. The recommendation that owners and tenants in occupation of property within 75 meters, 246 feet of 2306 Beacon Avenue be notified regarding development variance permit application number DV100344 to allow office uses to be located at ground level along Beacon Avenue, and that any written correspondence received to be forwarded to council at the time of consideration of approval of the variance.
Second.
We have that moved by Councillor Novick, seconded by Councillor Duck. I'll turn to the mover.
I don't have much to add. It was discussed at length. The nature of the property is such that we're not really taking away traditional retail space from Beacon Avenue. And so I'm quite happy to allow this to go through as recommended.
Thank you, Councillor Novick. I'll turn to the seconder, Councillor Duck. No discussion. Any further discussion, Councillor O'Keefe?
Oh, thanks. I'll just reiterate what I said last week is, as I said, I think this is a really good idea. It's something that's needed here. However, it's a type of business that doesn't need to be on Beacon. It could be on a second floor, it could be in a side street, and knowing that there's such little retail space available, I'm more in favor of returning it for future expansion for our retail sector. So I'll vote against that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. Any further discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Councillor O'Keefe is opposed. 1 opposed. The motion carries. Thank you. And Councillor Novick, I'll ask you to turn to the final recommendation.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And again, recommendation number 5 from committee of the whole meeting of last week, CRD Transportation Governance Engagement recommendation, and I so move that the CRD Transportation Governance Workbook and accompanying notes be approved and submitted to the CRD with the following amendment. Number 1, that the addition of all 4 boxes, should probably make that checked, on item number 3.
We have that moved.
Second.
And seconded by Councillor Rintoul. Councillor Novick?
Again, there was vibrant discussion on the CRD Transportation Governance Workbook. I think there's general consensus that this is something that the region needs, and it's a long process. It may take a couple of years before we see anything concrete, but I'm quite happy to support the advancement of the project.
Thank you, Councillor Novick. I'll turn to Councillor Rintoul.
Thank you.
Any further discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Sorry, did you wish to, I'll withdraw the question. Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. I just want to say in approving this, my view on this is I don't necessarily agree that a regional governance structure is the best thing for Sydney for this. However, what I understand this first step is to get some idea of some of the issues or concerns that we have at the local level. So to me, this isn't an endorsement of having a regional transportation governance structure, but I'm willing to go ahead with the process to provide some information to inform the process at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor, and I appreciate your comments, but as we spoke to during the presentation of the workbook, this workbook is not an endorsement by councils for a governance structure. It is, as you indicated, a high-level discussion at this stage. Seeing no further discussion, I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? None opposed. The motion carries unanimous. Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Novick, for taking us through the Committee of the Whole recommendations. We're now turning to section 13, which is staff reports, and the first is item 13A, license of occupation number 1404684, the water lot lease. We have a report to staff, and I'll turn to Ms. Clary for an introduction, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So this was brought before council originally in 2021. It amends an existing water lot lease, which includes the town's waterfront walkway, to add the existing concrete ramp between Diver Point and Glass Beach. The ramp was previously part of a lease that was privately held, but that private leaseholder didn't want to retain it any longer, so the town would like to take ownership of it.
Thank you, Ms. Clary. Are there any questions for staff? Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Mayor. Through you to staff. Looking at it and having gone down and looked at it on the weekend, and it speaks to the blocks in the report from 2021, and I noticed it has a do not enter sign on it, and I'm just wondering if staff's comfortable with any level of liability we might have in terms of somebody climbing over it and something happening that we don't want to, but just like staff's input on that.
Through to Councillor Garnett, we do look at these things on a regular basis. The signage and the blocks should be a large enough deterrent, and if someone passes that, they're doing it at their own risk. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Garnett. I'll turn to Councillor Duck.
Similarly, through you, Mayor, to staff, just clarification on what's going to happen with that part of the property. Are we going to leave it in as is condition, or are there any prospects of changing what the layout of that is going to be? Thank you.
Through to Councillor Duck. During the previous council meeting in 2021, council directed staff to consider this during future waterfront planning. So we will, when changes may come to that area of the waterfront, potentially Glass Beach, potentially a Divers Point. However, we don't have any immediate plans for it, so at this time it will stay as is.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Clary. Thank you, Councillor. I'll turn to Councillor Novick.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and again, through you to staff. This ramp into the water is a very useful device, and is certainly sought after by lots of people who want to use the water as a recreational area. And I guess my question is are there any plans to make use of that within the town's recreational capabilities?
Councillor Novick, with all respect, I think staff have answered that question with the previous question, but I'll turn to staff if they wish to comment again.
Through to Councillor Novak, the ramp as it sits is in an unsafe condition for somebody to use, so it would require quite a bit of work to bring it up to snuff, which is why we have put it in the plans for the long-term waterfront improvements. However, we don't have any current projects assigned to this particular ramp.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Any further discussion? We do have a staff recommendation. Councillor Duncan.
Yeah, I'll move the recommendation that the license of occupation number 1404684, which includes the concrete ramp located between Divers Point and Glass Beach, be approved.
Second.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor? The motion carries unanimous. Thank you. We're now turning to item 13B, which is the corporate logo redesign. And I'll turn to Ms. Judson for an introduction, please.
Thank you. On August 21st, Council reviewed proposed designs for a new corporate logo and shared some suggested edits to those. Those suggestions have been incorporated wherever possible, and two options are being presented today. For option A, which is the option that staff are recommending, we provided an example of the words town of incorporated into the logo, and that would be, if this option was approved, that would be one of a few variations that we would have to choose from depending on what communications product we were inserting our logo into. Also, the dark blue waves at the bottom were made gentler, reshaped a little bit so they look like calmer waters. The background color was made white and the blue was brought out to pop a little bit more, just creating a more vibrant image. We also reduced the image in height so that it had a little more versatility and wasn't such a long image. For option B, with that one, there were concerns about how recognizable the pier was because last time we brought it to council was quite a simplified image, and so we brought some detail back into the pier design and made those white lines thinner. And thank you for considering these options.
Thank you, Ms. Judson. I'll turn to staff if there are any, or turn to colleagues if there are any questions. Seeing none, sorry, Councillor Duck, go ahead.
If there are no questions, I'd like to move the recommendation.
Sorry, can you read the recommendation, please?
Sure. As recommended by staff, that logo option A be selected.
Second.
We have it moved and seconded. I'll turn to the mover.
Yeah, I'd just say comment and compliments to staff for coming back. I think it's we've done some great improvement to it. Looks ready to go. Let's get her on the paper.
Thank you, Councillor Duck. I'll turn to the seconder.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Ms. Judson, for your work on this and for being willing to go back to from the insights that council provided. And I have to say, as just looking at it, for me, I like the color contrast of the water, and for whatever reason, it actually draws me to the pier. I don't know if that was the intention, but if it was, it was really well done because I just naturally look at it, and I think that's kind of the essence of what you want to see there. And I just have to say, just as a slight little thing that I noticed, I know it was very subtle, but I noticed you changed the color of the town in Town Talk, because I was looking at the one upstairs today and it's black, and I like the fact that you've drawn colors from the logo into that. So good work. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Garnett. I'll turn to Councillor Duncan.
Thank you. I had to take a moment to speak and eat my words about the suitability of the Bevan Pier on our logo. I like the changes that have been made look really good, and I know I didn't like it because it was a pier that went nowhere, and I was worried about what it said about our town. And but then, you know, staff pointed out in the report that this was, you know, a crowdsourced project, actually, that the people of the town wanted this. They wanted to be able to use it. It is well used for crabbing and recreation, and so this is actually something that in reality the residents of the town built together by raising the money from the project, having this vision. And so it's actually a really nice image for a logo of the town because it's something that the town built together. And I was forced to remember that when I went to the Lantern Festival, where we all built things, we all made lanterns, marched down to this area, and then, you know, look back and there's the whole townscape streaming out onto this pier together with their lanterns that they've made to celebrate. And so it is probably it is an excellent symbol, and I will publicly eat my words on that, and say it looks really good when I look at, you know, how it fits with the other municipalities' symbols. So, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Duncan. Any further speakers? I'm not supportive of moving forward with this logo, and I'm turning. If we compare this logo, and I did bring the staff report from the previous council meeting. This logo is virtually identical to the original logo option that was chosen by approximately 60% of the residents. But the reason that the second option was preferred when we had the first meeting was because, as in that staff report, it said concerns were expressed about the complexity and color scheme option. And in going to option B, the dark waves at the bottom of the logo were removed, which removed not only complexity in terms of having those there, but also removed one of the 6 colors in the color scheme. And so I felt we were addressing those concerns that were being expressed. However, council at the last meeting expressed concern, they seem to share some of those concerns, but expressed concern with the other option of a simplified logo because the pier wasn't recognizable. I think the pier is more recognizable in that option. I think the light water color change is beneficial, but there is an improvement. But I still think that it's overly complex. And while we've had a positive comment from council in terms of how the logo looks relative to other logos, I've looked at a lot of logos throughout the region, the island, and the province. But the 3 that are even presented on page 5 of tonight's package, it is, I believe, a significantly more complex logo than either the Central Saanich or North Saanich. And I think it looks particularly more complex as it becomes smaller as it is in that image. And I think in most places where the logo will appear, for example, at the bottom of email addresses or on other correspondence or as part of letterheads, is that it will be fairly small and look overly complex. So I certainly appreciate all the work that has gone into this, that it came to council and that went back to the consultant. But it's been a kind of a lifelong thing with logos with the different organizations, for profit and not for profit, that I've been involved with, that I prefer pretty simple logos, and you'll find that the larger the organization, the more simple their logo is. And so I just wanted to provide that input, and certainly appreciate the work that's been done and the comments from my colleagues. I'll turn to Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. Also appreciate the additional work that's been done, but I agree with the mayor on this. It was just in terms of it being a little bit too busy. And to me, that really stood out when I looked at it compared to North Saanich and Central Saanich as well. Very, very simple compared to this. Too many lines. What I like that I like the Bevan Pier. I like that it's articulated better. But what I like about the last time and what I was hoping to see in this one was less lines, less waves or boulders. So I'm looking at the staff report from last time. I guess it would be on page 6, and that was the one that we didn't like because the pier wasn't articulated very well. It was big chunks, so I didn't like that. But I liked the cleaner look there because it was less busy and less lines. Because I agree, there's too much. It's too busy. I think it does need to be simplified and brought closer to what we saw in the option for that's on page 6. I can't remember if that was option A or B before, but yeah. So I'd like to see it simplified further. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. Councillor Novick.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I initially didn't want to be critical of the logo because I think they've done a good job at responding to the concerns that were brought forward. However, I have to agree with the mayor and with Councillor O'Keefe that while this is a nice image and it does reflect the town of Sydney, in my opinion, it's not a logo. Logos need to be very simple. They need to be very distinctive. They need to pop at you. They have to have a strong corporate message. And this doesn't have that. I'm not sure where to go from here. I'm not sure if rejecting this at this point sends it back to the drawing board and where does it start from here, or if it needs to be completely reimagined from the get-go. But when I look at this logo that has come to us, and I think of this on an email signature, on a letterhead, on promotional material, I believe that it is too complex as a logo, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Novak. I'll turn to Councillor Rintoul.
Thank you, Mayor. Following broad public consultation, the work of the consultant and staff, yeah, I'm very supportive of what's before us. And granted, council made some tweaks and some color's been added and some more definition to the pier, but I like it. I'll support it. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. Seeing no further discussion, I'll call a question. All in favor? Opposed? Councillor Novak, Councillor O'Keefe, and myself, the motion carries. Thank you to staff for the work that's been done. And we're now turning to the third staff report under item 13C, which is the Bevan Fishing Pier Rehabilitation Contract Award. I'll turn to Ms. Clary for an introduction, please.
Thank you. So in 2021, the town hired a consultant to review the Bevan Fishing Pier and establish a maintenance schedule for the structure. The consultant provided a number of approaches, and at that time, council directed staff to proceed with a proactive maintenance approach. The consultant then went on to do a detailed structural assessment and a dive inspection of the pier and developed a tender document, which was issued in early 2023. The town received 0 bids for that particular tender. Marine work is quite in high demand, and prices continue to escalate. So at the time, the consultant reached out to find out how we could get bids to do this proactive maintenance work. And some of the feedback that we received was that the work could be simplified and use only one product instead of 2. Originally, part of the project was a recoating project with like a paint type recoating, and the other portion was a wrap product. So the consultant went back to the drawing board and came up with another tender which used only the wrapping product, and we went back out to tender and we received 1 bid. This time the bid was quite over our available budget of from Heavy Metal Marine of $465,815 $70. Heavy Metal Marine is willing to work with the town if we did want to reduce the scope of the project and just complete a portion of the work this year. Thurber, who is the consultant for the project, reviewed the work and decided that if we were going to do that, it would be best to perform the work on the newer portion of the pier, which actually happens to be in worse condition than the older portion. So that is an option if we did want to just proceed under the existing budget for this year. However, this work is required at some point in the next couple of years, so staff are recommending that we proceed with the whole wrapping project this year. But that would involve adding an additional $325,000 from the Canada Community Build Fund to complete the work. We expect the total budget for the project to be $550,000. And we're here to answer any questions if you have any.
Thank you, Ms. Clary, for both the report and the introduction. I'll turn to colleagues and Councillor Garnett first.
Thank you, Mayor. Through you to staff and to Ms. Clary. If the staff recommendations are accepted by council and this moves forward, have Thurber given any indication of a timeline for Heavy Metal Marine to both begin and finish the project?
Through to Councillor Garnett, I did speak with Heavy Metal Marine to find out if they'd still be able to start the work this year. They said yes, they likely would. It will depend on tides and storm events, so it is a bit of a weather-dependent job, but they do hope to start this year if they're given the go-ahead.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you for the question, Councillor. I turn to colleagues. Councillor Rintoul.
Thank you, Mayor. Through to staff, I mean, it's obviously very specialty work. Were you and or Thurber surprised at no response initially when it went to tender, and secondly, when it was retendered in this format, that there was only one one bidder, or is that just a reflection again on the nature of this work in a special marine environment?
Through to Councillor Rintoul, there were a number of bidders at the pre-bid meeting for the first tender that went out, so it was a bit of a surprise that no bids were received. I think it was just too much of a specialty and too complex of a project. We were hopeful for hopefully one bid for the second time around. It would have been nice to get two, but it is a very busy industry right now. So.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Councillor. Seeing no further discussion, we do have a staff recommendation. Turn to Councillor Rintoul.
I move the recommendation that the 2023 Bevan Fishing Pier Pile Rehabilitation Project be awarded to Heavy Metal Marine, and two, that the 2023 budget for Bevan Fishing Pier Rehabilitation be increased to $550,000 with an additional $325,000 in funding from the Canada Community Building Fund.
Second.
Moved by Councillor Rintoul and seconded by Councillor Garnett. I'll turn to the mover.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this was a project that we knew would need to be undertaken. I think municipalities run the risk of seeing themselves fall into a real infrastructure deficit, if you will, if they avoid tackling these tough projects. I'm not inclined to think that they become any cheaper if you kick it down the road. In fact, it probably just impacts the likelihood of other infrastructure projects falling behind and making their realities at completion on a timely and cost-effective basis more challenging. So with that in mind, I'll support this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rintoul. Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I understand and totally agree with staff's rationale for wanting to do it this way. It makes complete sense, saving money, time, all of those factors. And given that we've just said that we want this on our logo, and preventative maintenance, the sooner you get to preventative maintenance, the better. So I definitely don't want this to be delayed. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Garnett. Not putting anybody's feet to the fire. Seeing no further discussion, I'll call the question. All in favor? The motion carries unanimous, and thank you to staff for moving this forward. We're now turning to our two items of correspondence. Council will recall that we did move 14A, the request for funding, to the group that presented this evening and have addressed that. But we do have item 14B, which is a letter from the chair of the CRD Arts and Cultural Support Service, and the letter and supporting documentation is in our council package. I will just speak to this briefly. There isn't a recommendation, but I will put a motion on the floor. I won't be advocating, motivating for it until after, if there's a seconder of the motion, but just for the benefit of the public and for our new members of council this term, council last term did consider this rejoining this service, CRD service. The CRD service was started in approximately 2001. The town of Sydney did not join the service until I believe it was 2008. I was serving on council when we first joined the service. We were members of the service for approximately 8 years, and the council in the 2014 to 2018 term passed a motion to withdraw from the service and did so. Our council did receive a presentation in one of the years, one of the 4 years from the CRD Arts Service, and chose not to move forward. Council, at one time we gave a volunteer contribution, which there was little precedent for. We weren't a voting member and weren't a full participant by doing that. And council last year's budget, or I'm sorry if it was this year's budget in 2023, determined that we would redirect that contribution to the ACKNOWLEDGEMENT Peninsula Arts Community organization. And so I appreciate, that's a little bit of the background. My motion is to, that I wish to put on the floor for discussion is to, within the letter, the chair of the service, the chair of the commission, Victoria Mayor Marian Alto, says the CRD Arts Commission passed a motion for her as chair of the Arts Commission to send letters to all jurisdictions that currently do not participate in the Arts Service, inviting them to join outlining the benefits of joining, and as I said, there's accompanying documentation. And for the public's benefit, who may not have seen the council package, there are currently 9 local government jurisdictions in the CRD participating, including the larger core municipalities, but also municipalities such as Souk, Metchosin, Highlands, and the Southern Gulf Islands. And so my motion is to move this request to a future council meeting, inviting CRD's Arts Service to make a presentation to council.
I'll second that.
Thank you. And so my motivation briefly is that I feel that while council has considered this and taken direction, that I think something that I've spoken to in the past, but not to the extent that I'll speak to it this evening, is that currently council has approved annual grants to the Artsy Peninsula Arts Council of $54,800 a year, and that includes $3,000 for the sculpture walk, $25,000 in general funding, and $26,800 for local arts grants program. And previous council increased that grants program substantially over 2 stages, one last term and again at the beginning of this term. And so that is a significant amount that we're contributing to the Peninsula Arts community, and certainly support that. I want to draw an analogy with, or a comparison, if you will, with 2 other CRD Arts services. And so the CRD Regional Parks requisition amount from Sydney taxpayers is in 2023 is $570,697. So we provide local parks in our community, but the Sydney taxpayers through CRD tax requisition are paying $570,000 towards the regional park system. I'm currently chair, as your CRD director, chair of the Regional Parks Commission. It's a park system encompassing 33 regional parks and over 13,000 hectares of parkland. And while there may be many residents who don't access our regional parks, that's been in place since the early 2000s as well. The CRD also has a recreational requisition. So for the sub-regional panorama recreation, the requisition in 2023 from Sydney residents is $1,535,000. And so we provide, the municipality, through our budgeting process, provides significant recreation facilities within our park system municipally, but then again, we have approved by a council quite some time ago, agreeing to join the CRD Park Service, or Recreation Service, and that's the current requisition. One of the points of note with regards to the Panorama Rec Commission is there's a number of people who suggest that, well, our residents who go to arts performances elsewhere in the region are contributing to the arts community by virtue of their admission fee. If you're going to the ballet at the Royal Theatre, or you're going, and that should be the contribution of our residents to regional arts. However, the Panorama Recreation budget is generally structured such that about 50% of the operating revenues come from this requisition from the 3 municipalities, and 50% comes from user fees from the residents that actually use the recreation facility. So when we turn to what we're currently allocating in 2023 to our municipal parks and recreation, I turn to Mr. Hissick, who provided quite a bit of detail. He provided a total amount of $1,511,000 plus capital of $1,057,000, almost $1,058,000. But it included parks and cultural, and so it included things like the public tree spaces, cul-de-sac program, downtown maintenance, flags, banners, Christmas program, community celebrations, and Sydney Days. So I removed that $335,562 that could be considered more cultural and stayed with the budget allocations to things like Iroquois Park buildings, Tallista Park. We know the recreation facilities we have, such as tennis courts, pickleball, skateboard park, volleyball court, playground equipment such as the zip line in Rest Haven Park and so on. So we're contributing 1 million, or council has approved this year approximately 1,175,000 to our local parks and recreation. My point is that where Sydney residents are contributing significantly to parks and recreation locally, to the tune of almost $1.2 million. They're doing so regionally to the tune of $570,000 to regional parks and to regional, and $1.5 million to regional recommendation. That's $2 million. Yet we're contributing $54,000 to the arts community on the peninsula, and we're not participating in the regional program that has been in place for 20 years and now has a fund of almost $3 million. It's $2.9 million. And so I think it's worthy of us considering not only those factors, but a presentation from the CRD Commission to view this. I remain fully supportive of the support we provide to the Peninsula arts community and arts organization, but feel it's time that we joined, or seriously considered rejoining in view of the other municipalities that are part of the program in the CRD region. With that, I will turn to colleagues, and I'll begin with Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. So I'm not in favor of the motion. First, we've discussed this several times in the past, in the last term and in this term as well. So since it's brought up, I'll bring up the same comments that I've brought up before, and a few others. So for those who are maybe new to council, from 2014 to 2018, the town of Sydney contributed $98,000 to the CRD as members of that program. And we received $58,000. So that was an average of $11,000 a year coming from CRD to support a local arts community. So, you know, we don't, we put in a lot of money, we're not going to get it all back again. And some might argue, well, that's because you're contributing to the regional ecosystem. And I'll deal with that separately in a second. The other thing that I think is relevant to mention about the CRD arts program, when we fully participated in it, over the entire 5-year period, the amounts that were received, there was only 5 organizations that were eligible to apply for those funds and received funds. So it was the same groups over 5 years, only 5 organizations on the peninsula. And that's one of the reasons why previous councils backed away from the CRD program. Some elements about the CRD program that make it difficult for groups to apply, and Artsy mentioned this in the letter they forwarded to us during budget negotiations, is only registered nonprofit groups can apply for that funding. They have to provide audited financial statements. Individuals or small groups that are doing artwork or providing program, they don't have the opportunity to apply to the CRD because it's quite a rigorous program, not just to meet those elements, but when you look at the application as well. So those are some of the reasons that previous councils did not support it, and it's why our local artsy doesn't support it as well. When we look at, in terms of the regional contribution, I get the fact that I think what has been discussed in the past is that, you know, we should have an obligation to support the regional arts ecosystem just like we do parks and other things. However, I think that Sydney is more than punching above its weight in terms of supporting the regional arts. So when I look at arts and culture, in 2021, staff, when we reviewed this, staff provided a report for us to talk about all the things that we're doing out here. So in terms of the hundreds of $1,000s that we pour into Mary Winspear Center and to Artsy and to the museum and the Shaw Center. So I think in the report they provided us about $1 million. And so I think we are contributing to the regional arts ecosystem and regional arts by providing a hub for the arts for out here. And people from all over the CRD come to the Mary Winspear Center. They come to the gallery. So I think we're making a significant contribution. When I look at the other members of the who are members of the CRD Arts Program, most of them, I believe, aside from Victoria, they don't have like a big Mary Winspear Center like us. They might have smaller venues, but so I think in terms of that regional support, we're doing that. I think we also covered also that our local artsy also those funds that go to artsy and all the programs that they provide, those are regional as well. So any artist is able to join artsy. About 30% of their members are from outside of Sydney and the peninsula, and they're eligible to use our art gallery. And that's something that a lot of small artists and groups don't have access to. So I guess what I'm saying is I think we're doing a good job at having an arts hub here on the peninsula that serves the greater CRD, and so I don't see a reason for us to join the CRD Arts. I don't think there's anything new that I expect to hear, so I'm not in favor of hearing from them again. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. I'll turn to colleagues. Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Mayor. And I sat in those very chairs over there when I attended council meetings, and I remember this discussion of when the 2014 to 2018 council actually decided to pull out of it. And I think the consensus at the table was, and it was a lot of information was given by the liaison or the committee member who sat from council, who sat on there, and who also was involved with Artsy as a liaison, I believe. And what stood out to me was the fact that so very little of our organizations on the peninsula got any of the grant funding. And that's part of the letter which speaks to, you have the same access to granting programs of the Art Service, but in reality they don't, to many of the reasons that Councillor O'Keefe spoke to. And having many I know many artists in the community, having many one-on-one conversations, they express the same level of dissatisfaction or concern about the lack of ability to get funding for their arts. And that's why when they made that decision, I was sitting out there thinking that, this is probably a good way to go. And that's why I agreed with that in the first term, last term. And the letter of rationale Artsy provided this term. From my perspective, and it's mine alone, my preference would be to see us help our local artists in this community. And if it's already a struggle to be an artist, and granting is an important aspect of your what you want to follow as your dream and your passion, and you have that access basically not available to you, at least in your own community through granting through Artsy, they can provide opportunities for our local artists they can't get anywhere else. And I want to see them have the chance to thrive and grow in their art forms. So I won't support the motion either. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Garnett. Turn to other speakers. Councillor Novick.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Unfortunately, I don't have the history that my colleagues do with this group in the past. However, just in going through the presentation, going through the letter of Mayor Alto, I feel that it's something that the town of Sydney should be involved in. I think that there's an opportunity from within the organization to find ways of funding some of the smaller groups that are presently excluded from funding. And by the way, I don't agree with that. I think the funding should not be so tightly restricted only to not-for-profits that have audited statements, because there are, as noted, many groups that are smaller and deserve an opportunity to grow and become larger groups. So I'd like to at very least see the presentation and perhaps ask some of these questions to the either commissioners or staff, and to perhaps see if there is an opportunity to bring this back to Sydney.
Thank you, Councillor Novick. Seeing no other speakers, I just wish to address one comment from Councillor O'Keefe with regards to the $412,103 that our council has approved through past policy to the Mary Winspear Centre. And the CRD has, as I've updated council in the last term, been pursuing a regional funding program for arts facilities. And there's a distinction to be drawn between funding for facilities versus funding for arts programming. And so while we do contribute generously to and have support from North Saanich for the Mary Winspear Centre, that is culture, arts and culture and other community facility. None of those monies goes to directly to arts programming. Another aspect with respect to Mary Winspear Centre, and we heard from the previous executive director of in a previous year, that the impact of our decision not to be part of CRD Regional Arts is that there are a number of groups, and if you look at the report, there are many dozens of groups that do get funding from the CRD service out of the $2.9 million. That when they submit their applications and they want to have their performances in Sydney, so they're a regional, a CRD arts organization based outside of Sydney, and they want to perform at the Mary Winspear Centre, they cannot receive grant funding through the CRD to do that, and that's an unfortunate detriment to our performing arts facility. The CRD last term had a consultant do a survey of arts organizations and arts facilities organizations, and a lot of arts organizations throughout the CRD find it of great value to rehearse and perform at the Mary Winspear Centre because it is a smaller venue, particularly the theatre, compared to the Royal or the McPherson. And so they're at a disadvantage within that CRD program and it has an impact for our, for our Mary Winspear Centre and for the benefit that our residents might enjoy. Another aspect highlighted in the article is that our region arts and cultural sector employs over 4,000 cultural workers. And so we have people who work as performers in Sydney, around the region, and they perform, they are employed in facilities around the region. And so it would be of benefit to support those cultural workers and the arts economy, the arts ecosystem to be supportive through the CRD program. I'll leave my comments there for now. Again, I'm inviting council or making the request for council to consider a presentation, particularly for the two new members of council from the CRD commission. Seeing no further speakers, we have the motion on the floor. I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Councillor Duncan, Councillor Garnett, Councillor O'Keefe, and Councillor Duck are opposed. The motion is defeated, and the request will not go forward. We have 6 items of correspondence under correspondence for information this evening. None of those were raised by council members on the agenda, so we are receiving them by virtue of them being on the agenda. We have no notices of motion and no motion to go on camera, so I will look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Moved and seconded. All in favor? We are adjourned.